The skyline of Chicago came at her like a fist. Elena Ward had not expected that. She had prepared herself on the flight from Seattle. 3 hours of practiced indifference, 3 hours of telling herself that returning to this city was a business decision, a matter of loyalty to her brother, nothing more than geography rearranging itself around her carefully reconstructed life. She had rehearsed her composure the way a soldier rehearses entering a known war zone, methodically, with eyes open and the pulse deliberately slow. But then the plane banked low over Lake Michigan, and the city rose up beneath her, that impossible, jagged crown of glass and steel and old stone, Lakeshore Drive threading gold in the early evening light, the dark water beside it stretching cold and endless toward a horizon that had no mercy. And Elena felt the breath leave her body, as though the city itself had reached through the oval window and pulled it free. Chicago. She pressed 2 fingers to the glass and then pulled them back. 9 years. 9 years, and the city looked exactly the same. Chicago was not the kind of place that softened while you were away. It did not forgive absence, did not lighten itself on your behalf, did not smooth the sharp edges of its architecture or the sharper edges of its memory into something more welcoming. Chicago waited. It simply waited, the way a creditor waits, patient, certain, entirely sure of what it is owed. Elena Ward, 31 years old, settled her hands in her lap and looked away from the window. She was beautiful in the particular way that came from discipline rather than ease. Dark hair cut to the collarbone, cheekbones that might have belonged to a painting, eyes the precise gray-green of lake water in November. She wore a charcoal blazer over a cream silk blouse, and if you looked at her from across the cabin of the plane, you would think composed. You would think controlled. You would think, this is a woman who has everything in its rightful place. You would be exactly half right. Her phone buzzed. Lucas. Tell me you're on descent. The Castellano meeting is tomorrow morning, and I need you briefed by 9 tonight. She typed back, on approach, car arranged, see you at the estate. The estate. Even typing the word felt like swallowing glass. The Ward family estate sat on the north shore of Lake Michigan, 40 minutes from O'Hare, behind iron gates and old money and the kind of silence that only very large spaces filled with secrets could produce. Elena had grown up in that house, had learned to walk in its corridors, had eaten at its long dining table, had discovered books in its library and heartbreak in its gardens. She had not set foot inside it in 9 years. She had not set foot inside Chicago in 9 years. And the reason for that absence, the singular, devastating, still breathing reason, was not her brother's business needs, was not the distance, was not the comfortable fiction she had constructed in Seattle about needing space and finding herself. The reason had a name and a face and a particular way of standing in a room that made every other person in it seem as though they were made of slightly lesser material. Victor Hale. She was not going to think about Victor Hale. The plane touched down. The car that met her at the terminal was black and gleaming, the kind of vehicle that announced wealth without apologizing for it. The driver, a young man she didn't recognize, which meant Lucas had turned over staff in the years she'd been gone, took her single suitcase without being asked and held the door. Elena settled into the back seat and watched Chicago unfold around her as they moved from the airport onto the expressway. The city was denser than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply forgotten how much of it there was. The neighborhoods stacking one against the other, the bridges over the dark river, the neighborhoods where old brick buildings had been converted into restaurants and art galleries and boutique hotels, the neighborhoods where nothing had been converted into anything and likely never would be. She watched it all with the particular attention of a person cataloging evidence. Lucas had summoned her back with a combination of need and authority that she recognized as characteristic of him. Her brother, 10 years her senior, the kind of man who expressed love primarily through commands. I need you here, Elena. I need someone I can trust at my right hand. The Ward Group is expanding, and the Castellano Alliance requires someone with your financial acumen. Come home. What he had not said, and what she had spent 3 weeks convincing herself did not matter, was, Victor will be there. Of course Victor would be there. Victor Hale was the co-architect of everything the Ward Empire had become over the past 9 years. He and Lucas had built together, had bled together, had turned a moderately powerful Chicago operation into something that the other families spoke of with a reverence that teetered on fear. Victor was as much a part of the Ward organization as Elena's own last name. This was, of course, the central agony of her situation. The car turned north, and she watched the lake appear on her right. Black water, the last light dying in the west, the distant wink of a buoy. She had loved this lake once, had driven along it with the windows down in the summer, had walked its shore in winter while her hands went numb in her coat pockets, had sat on its banks with a man who spoke rarely, but when he did, spoke with a kind of precision that made you feel seen in a way that was almost uncomfortable. Victor had always been like that, like a scalpel wrapped in darkness. She turned her eyes from the water and pulled out her briefing files. Work. There was always work. The estate appeared at the end of a long private drive, and it was exactly as she remembered. 3 stories of pale stone and dark windows, ivy thick on the east wing, lights burning in what she knew was the study. The grounds were immaculate, because Lucas permitted nothing less. The gate had opened before the car reached it, which meant the security cameras had clocked her approach, which meant someone, probably Marcus, Lucas's head of security, had been told to watch for her. The front door opened before she reached the steps. Lucas Ward was not a man who made small impressions. He was tall, dark-haired, with the kind of face that had always conveyed authority, even when they were children. A face that had never quite learned to arrange itself into anything casual. He was 51 now, and age had added weight to the authority, rather than subtracting from it. He wore a dark suit, tie loosened, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately classify. "You came," he said. "You asked," she said. He descended the steps and embraced her, and it was the embrace of a man who had rehearsed restraint, arms tight for exactly 2 seconds, then releasing. She had missed him and resented missing him, and had spent 9 years knowing that both feelings were entirely his fault. "You look well," he said, studying her face in the way he had always studied things, assessing rather than simply seeing. "You look tired," she said, because he did, because there was something under the usual authority in his face that she didn't quite recognize, a kind of excavation, as though something had been working on him from inside. He waved the observation away with one hand. "Come in, we have a great deal to cover." She followed him up the steps and through the front door, and the smell of the house hit her like a wave. Old wood and expensive wax, and something faintly herbal from whatever the kitchen had been doing, and underneath it all the indefinable atmospheric signature of a particular building that had been home, that had held her childhood and her adolescence and the beginning of everything she'd had to run from. She kept her face perfectly still. "The Castellano situation," Lucas said, already leading her toward the study, "is more delicate than I explained over the phone. Matteo Castellano is not his father. He's younger, he's ambitious, and he has been testing the boundaries of our arrangement for the better part of 18 months. We need to renegotiate the terms, and we need to do it from a position that makes clear the Ward Group's primacy, while giving him sufficient face-saving latitude that he doesn't go sideways on us. What's the financial leverage? That's what I need you to map out. Their gaming operation has been underperforming, and I believe they've been skimming from our shared interests in the Lakeview properties." He opened the study door and gestured her inside. "I need you to go through the accounts and give me numbers I can use." She set her bag on the chair she'd always used at that desk, 9 years ago, before. "Fine," she said. "And the other thing?" Lucas paused in the doorway. "What other thing?" "The other thing you haven't mentioned yet. The reason this requires my physical presence in Chicago rather than a secure video call and a digital file transfer." He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched him decide how much to give her. "Victor will be joining us for the Castellano meeting. He's been managing the West Side operations, and his relationship with the Castellanos is—" A pause, waited. "Complicated." "Complicated," she repeated. "He'll be civil." "I have no doubt Victor Hale will be exactly whatever he decides to be," she said, which was true, and which conveyed absolutely nothing of what she felt, which was the whole point. She opened the first file. "I'll have the preliminary account analysis ready by 9. Lucas watched her for another moment, and then nodded and left. Elena sat alone in the study she had once shared with her brother and opened the financial files of the Ward Group's Chicago operations and told herself that this was fine, that she was fine, that 9 years was a very long time and she had grown and changed and was an entirely different person than the 22-year-old woman who had packed a single bag in the middle of the night and called a taxi to O'Hare. She told herself this for approximately 4 minutes. Then she picked up her pen and began to work. The morning of the Castellano meeting arrived gray and cold, the kind of late October Chicago morning that felt personal, as though the weather had looked up the date on its calendar and decided to dress accordingly. Elena had been awake since 5, which was not unusual for her. She had not slept properly in 9 years, not since Seattle, not since the particular torment of an uneasy conscience had made deep sleep a thing she experienced only occasionally and always with the slight suspicion that something was about to go wrong. She dressed with the same deliberate care she brought to everything, a steel blue sheath dress, heels that added 3 inches to her height, her hair swept back and pinned with the kind of severity that said, "Do not mistake me for someone who can be charmed." She reviewed the account analysis she'd prepared the night before, annotated the key leverage points, and was in the dining room with coffee and the rest of her documents by 8:15. Lucas appeared at 8:40, studied her summary with the focused attention that had always been one of his better qualities, made 2 requests for clarification that she'd already anticipated, and was satisfied with her answers in a way that suggested he'd forgotten how good she actually was at this. At 9:15, she heard the front door. She heard it, which was the telling thing, because the Ward estate was not a small house, and the distance from the entrance hall to the dining room was considerable. She should not have been able to hear a door opening, but she had been listening for it, without quite admitting to herself that she was listening, and so she heard it, the precise, heavy sound of a door that opened and closed with absolute authority. And then footsteps in the hall, and then silence. And then the dining room door opened. Victor Hale walked into the room, and Elena Ward looked down at her papers and kept her face like marble, and felt the whole architecture of her carefully constructed distance develop a hairline fracture. He was different. That was the word she reached for first, because it was the safest. He was different from the man she'd left behind. He was 40 now, and the years had done to him what they tended to do with men of a certain type. They had stripped away everything extraneous and left only what was essential, only what was fundamental, and what was fundamental in Victor Hale was devastating. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps it was the way he stood now, with the absolute, unhurried authority of a man who has never had to justify his presence in a room. His face was leaner, more angular, the jaw sharper, lines beside his eyes and mouth that had not been there before. His hair was darker gray at the temples now, which should not have been as attractive as it was. He wore a charcoal suit of exquisite construction, no tie, the collar of his shirt open by exactly 1 button, and he carried nothing, no phone, no files, nothing. Victor Hale had never needed props. He looked at her. That was all. He simply looked at her, for precisely the amount of time it would take another person to glance and look away, and in that glance was 9 years of something Elena couldn't name and refused to examine, and then his gaze moved to Lucas as though she were simply an item of furniture he had noted and catalogued and set aside. "Lucas," he said. His voice was lower than she remembered, which should have been impossible. "Victor, sit down. We're reviewing the Castellano terms before they arrive." Lucas gestured to the seat across from Elena. Victor sat. He did not look at her again. This was, Elena told herself firmly, a relief. She gave her analysis without looking at him. She spoke about the financial leverage, about the underperforming gaming operation, about the 3 specific areas in the Lakeview accounts where she believed money had been redirected without authorization. She spoke with the crisp, clipped authority of someone who had spent 9 years in Seattle, building a professional identity that had nothing to do with the Ward name, that was entirely her own. The Elena Ward who had gone to Columbia for her MBA, who had worked her way into a senior financial analysis role at a hedge fund, who had been the most organized and coldly effective person in every room she'd ever entered since the age of 22. When she finished, there was a brief silence. "The Lakeview discrepancy," Victor said, and his voice was entirely businesslike, entirely unremarkable, "has been on my radar for 6 months. The shortfall is closer to 4.2 million than your estimate of 3.8. I'll have confirmation figures to you by this afternoon. She looked at him, just briefly. Their eyes met, and then she was looking back at her papers. That changes the leverage calculation, she said. It strengthens it, he said. Yes. Agree on the approach to Castellano's East Side interests, he said to Lucas. Don't telegraph the gaming information before we've established the tone. Let him underestimate what we know. Agreed, Lucas said. And then the Castellanos arrived, and Elena was in the meeting, and she was brilliant at it. She was always brilliant at these things, because her mind had a particular gift for finding the load-bearing number in any financial structure, the one figure that could move everything else. And she found it 20 minutes into Matteo Castellano's carefully choreographed presentation of his own grievances. She presented it quietly, precisely, and watched Matteo's confidence deflate like a punctured tire. Through all of it, Victor watched her. Not obviously. Not in a way that anyone else in the room would have noticed. But Elena noticed, because she was trying very hard not to, and the effort of trying not to notice a thing makes you exquisitely sensitive to exactly that thing. She could feel the weight of his attention the way you feel the approach of weather before the sky shows it. A pressure change, an electrical quality to the air on the side of her body that faced him. She gave nothing back. When the meeting concluded, successfully, the Castellano terms revised substantially in the ward group's favor, Matteo's bluster collapsed neatly by the numbers Elena had arranged, and the Castellano party had been seen out by Marcus, Elena gathered her files and stood. Excellent work, Lucas said, and he meant it. I'll have the revised terms drafted by end of business, she said. She was halfway to the door when Victor spoke. Elena. She stopped. The sound of her name in his voice was not something she had prepared for. Not adequately. Not with all the practice she had done on the plane. She had forgotten, or had refused to remember, the exact timbre of it, the way he said it as though it were not simply a name, but something with specific weight. She turned. He was standing now, hands in the pockets of his suit jacket, looking at her with an expression she could not read and would not try to. You've been in Seattle, he said. It was not a question. Yes, she said. You're staying in Chicago now? For the foreseeable future. A pause. He held her gaze and she held his, and across the space of the room something enormous and completely soundless occurred. Good, he said, and turned away. Elena walked out of the room. In the corridor, she pressed her back briefly against the wall, closed her eyes, and took exactly 3 measured breaths. Then she walked on. She lasted 4 days before Chicago began to remember itself to her. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of remembering that arrives in a single overwhelming moment. That came later, came differently. It was the slow creep of familiarity, the way a city reclaims a person who belongs to it even when that person has spent 9 years insisting they belong somewhere else. She found herself knowing, without thinking, which streets to take from the estate to the ward group's downtown offices. Found herself remembering the particular quality of light off Lake Michigan on clear mornings, the way it silvered everything. Found herself walking into a coffee shop on Michigan Avenue and knowing what was on the menu before she looked. Chicago was inside her in ways she could not evict. The work helped. Lucas had been right about one thing. The ward group's expansion was real and considerable, and the financial architecture of what they were building required more sustained attention than a remote consultant could give it. Elena threw herself into it with the focused energy of someone who had always been better at working than at the other things life required of her. She mapped the revenue streams, identified the vulnerabilities, rebuilt the accounting structures that had grown imprecise during a period of rapid expansion. She saw Victor every day. Not extensively, not in private. Always in the context of meetings, of operational discussions, of the practical, daily business of running a large and complicated organization that operated simultaneously in the legitimate economy and in the considerably less legitimate arrangements that undergirded it. They spoke about numbers and about territory and about the logistics of the Castellano renegotiation. They were professional. They were appropriate. They were entirely civil. And every evening, Elena sat in her rooms on the second floor of the estate and tried to figure out how much of this she could endure. On the fourth evening, Lucas came to find her. She was on the sitting room balcony off her bedroom, a glass of wine in hand she hadn't particularly wanted, watching the lake go dark in the October twilight. She heard him before she saw him, his particular heavy step on the old floorboards, the way he always knocked twice and opened before she answered. "You're not eating," he said. "I ate. You moved food around a plate at dinner." She looked at him. He was in shirt sleeves, the authority slightly softened by fatigue, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed. "Lucas, I'm fine." "You're thin." "I'm the same weight I've been for 6 years." That's not necessarily a reassuring statement. He came onto the balcony and stood beside her, looking at the water. For a while, neither of them spoke, and this was old, this silence between them. Not comfortable exactly, but known. They had always been this way, she and her brother. People who shared space rather than words, who communicated in the language of proximity rather than speech.
"Is it too much?" he asked, finally. "Being back? Is it—"
"It's fine," she said, which was what she always said, and which he had always accepted as the full answer she would give, and therefore accepted as adequate. Tonight, however, he said, "Elena." Just her name. The way he said it when he was about to say the real thing. She waited. "He's changed," Lucas said. "He's—" A pause that she felt him work through. "He runs the whole operation now, with a kind of control that I find impressive and occasionally alarming. He's not reckless, he's never been reckless, but there's an intensity to him now that wasn't there before. A solitude." She said nothing. "I'm not saying this to—" Lucas stopped again. "I don't know what I'm saying it for. I just want you to know he's not dangerous to you. Not that way. Whatever happened between you, he would never—" "Nothing happened between us," Elena said, her voice perfectly steady. Her brother looked at her. "Elena, there was a brief—" She stopped. Even now, after 9 years, diminishing it felt like a violence, like pressing a lit match against something that deserved better. "It was a long time ago," she said, finally. "It's been handled." "Has it?" Lucas said, and it wasn't a question. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment, with the expression she'd been seeing on his face since childhood, whenever she said something he knew was not the full truth. And then he nodded and changed the subject, and they talked about the Castellano situation and the expansion plans, until he said goodnight and left. Elena stayed on the balcony until the lake was fully dark, and the wine was warm and she was cold, and then she went inside. From the window she could see, distantly, the lights of the east wing where Victor kept his private quarters. The lights were on. She looked at them for longer than was wise, and then she drew the curtains and went to bed. 3 days later, the ward group held a fundraising gala at the Meridian, their flagship hotel on the Magnificent Mile. 11 floors of marble and glass and carefully curated luxury. The kind of hotel that hosted governors' dinners and charity auctions and, on the 43rd floor, a private club whose membership list and activities were known to a very select group of people, none of whom discussed them in public. Elena attended in a black gown that had been designed for exactly this kind of occasion, severe and beautiful, with a neckline that was daring without being performative, and a silhouette that said, "I am entirely aware of every person looking at me and entirely indifferent to their opinions." She moved through the crowd of Chicago's wealthy and powerful with the fluid competence of someone who had been doing this since she was a girl, who had learned at her brother's knee how to work a room while revealing exactly nothing. She was speaking with the wife of a city councilman and half listening to the music when she became aware of Victor arriving. The room didn't shift, not obviously, but it did something. There was a subtle reorganization of attention, a collective reorientation, the kind of thing that happened in rooms when someone entered who carried sufficient gravity to affect the space around them. She didn't look. She kept her eyes on the councilman's wife and continued the conversation about the Ward Foundation's arts initiative, and registered with the peripheral awareness she'd spent 9 years sharpening that he had come in from the north entrance, that he was wearing black, that he was alone. Victor Hale moved through social situations the way he moved through everything, as though the entire landscape had been arranged for his passage. She had watched him at dozens of these events 9 years ago, and she had watched him the same way then. with the terrified exhilaration of someone standing at the edge of something that could destroy them, and finding the drop beautiful anyway. She was not doing that now. She extracted herself from the councilman's wife with practiced grace and made her way to the bar. And she was ordering water because she needed to keep her head clear, when a voice behind her said, "Still avoiding champagne?" She turned. He was standing close, not inappropriately close, not close enough that anyone watching would notice, but close enough that she could see the fine detail of his face in the candlelight, the specific dark of his eyes. "I'm working," she said. "So am I," he said. "Then we're both doing our jobs." He looked at her. Not the professional, cataloging glance he'd been deploying all week, but something different. A look that went past the steel blue composure and the pinned hair and the 9 years of carefully constructed indifference, and found something older underneath. Something that she'd buried, but had apparently not buried well enough. "You've gotten very good at it," he said. "At what?" "Looking at me as though I'm a stranger." The words were quiet. The words were delivered with the same calm precision he applied to everything, and they hit her exactly the way she suspected he intended them to hit her, which was in the place where she had no armor. She held his gaze for 2 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than she should have. "I have a constituent matter to address with the councilman's chief of staff," she said. "Excuse me." She walked away, and she did not look back. Behind her, she felt him watch her go. October turned on its axis and became a colder thing, and the Ward estate settled into the particular rhythm of autumn. Shorter days, the lake showing its temper more frequently, the trees in the garden surrendering their color with an elegance that Elena had always found privately moving. She ran in the mornings along the private lakeshore path, which she had used to do as a girl and which she had missed in Seattle with a fidelity she'd been reluctant to admit. And she worked long days, and she attended the necessary dinners and meetings and social functions with the steady professionalism that had become her primary mode of being. She had been in Chicago for 11 days. She had spoken to Victor Hale in a professional context 17 times. She had counted. What she had not done, and continued not doing with a determination that was beginning to exhaust her, was look at him for longer than necessary. Sit near him when there were other options. Acknowledge, even privately, the fact that 9 years had done nothing, not one single measurable thing, to diminish the way her entire nervous system reorganized itself when he was in the room. This was inconvenient. More than inconvenient. It was a problem of the first order, because Elena had built her return on the premise that what she felt was historical, that it was a chapter from a woman who no longer existed, that the Elena Ward who had loved Victor Hale with the helpless totality of first profound love was someone she'd left behind in the same city, in the same estate, in the same autumn 9 years previous. She had believed this, had worked to make it true, had dated in Seattle 2 men who were kind and stable and entirely incapable of making her feel anything she could not manage, and had ended both relationships with the clean precision of someone who understood exactly why they hadn't worked, and saw no point in prolonging the experiment. The problem, she was discovering, with building your recovery around the theory that a feeling can be outlasted, is the moment when the evidence suggests the theory is wrong. On the 12th day, she was working late in the study. It was nearly 10 at night, the house quiet, Lucas having retired early with what she'd noted was the beginning of a cough he was dismissing with characteristic impatience, when her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. "Mr. Hale has asked that the Q3 Lakeview summaries be forwarded to his office tonight. He has an 8 a.m. call with the Ricci's attorneys." She looked at the files on her desk. They were ready. She had been planning to send them digitally, as she sent everything, as was entirely sensible given that it was 10 in the evening and the rational procedure for delivering a digital file was to press send on an email rather than physically. Marcus's follow-up message arrived. "His secure server is having technical difficulties tonight. Physical copies only." Elena sat with this for a moment. Physical delivery. To Victor's private office, which was in the east wing of the estate, 2 corridors and a flight of stairs from the study where she was sitting. At 10 o'clock in the evening. This was fine. This was entirely fine. She was an adult professional delivering documents to a business colleague, and the fact that the business colleague in question was... She gathered the files. The east wing at night was a different country from the rest of the house. Lucas's domain, the main study, the formal dining room, the front of the estate, was all dark paneling and heavy furniture and the institutional grandeur of old money. The east wing was older, had been renovated perhaps 20 years ago in a different aesthetic. Cleaner lines, fewer ornaments, the kind of spare elegance that belonged to a person who did not need the reassurance of abundant objects. Victor had lived in the east wing since... she did not know since when. She had not been in the east wing before. She walked down the corridor with the documents under her arm, the house silent around her, the October storm that had been building all day finally arriving outside. She could hear rain beginning against the windows, and the sound of distant thunder, and the particular quality of light that comes when lightning backlights clouds. That intermittent silver bruising of the sky she could see through the corridor windows. The office. His private office should be the second door on the left, past the main sitting room on this floor. She had checked the estate plan, or rather, she had noted it with the part of her brain that noted everything useful. She walked to the second door on the left, tried the handle. The door opened and she stepped inside, and reached for the light switch, but the lights didn't respond. The technical fault Marcus had mentioned, presumably, and in the darkness, illuminated by the first real crack of lightning through the tall windows, she looked around and understood immediately that she had made an error. This was not an office, this was a bedroom. Specifically, it was a bedroom that was very clearly lived in, recently, regularly. A bed dressed in charcoal gray linen at the room's center, a fireplace dark but laid with wood on the left wall, bookshelves that lined the far wall and were genuinely used, books with broken spines and paper bookmarks rather than decorative volumes arranged for appearance. A desk in the corner beneath the window, covered in papers. A jacket over the back of the chair. She should leave. She should turn around and close the door and find the correct room. She did not leave. Because the lightning flashed again, stronger this time, and in that longer second of illumination, she saw what was on the bed, folded with the careful neatness of a person who handles things with particular reverence. A shirt. It was pale blue, faded from washing, and the collar was worn, and it was cut for a woman, and Elena knew that shirt. She knew it the way you know your own handwriting, your own scent, the specific timbre of your own voice when it comes back to you from a recording. She had bought that shirt in a small boutique near Wicker Park when she was 21, had worn it through one long summer and one autumn, had left it behind when she left, had been 22 and panicked and running, had left things she shouldn't have left and taken things she hadn't needed. She had not thought about that shirt in years, or had thought about it only obliquely, the way you think about things you've deliberately stopped thinking about. Victor Hale had kept it folded on his bed, with the care of a person who valued what was inside the fold. Her hand found the back of the chair near the door, and she steadied herself against it, and the lightning came again, and this time she saw the desk clearly. The papers, yes, but also photographs. Not displayed in frames, not arranged for show, but stacked and visible. The kind of photographs that belong to a person's private collection rather than their public life. And even from this distance, even in the intermittent light of the storm, she could tell. The hair, the jawline, the particular way the subject stood, turned slightly away from the camera, not knowing they were being observed. Herself. Those were photographs of her. She was standing absolutely still in the center of the room, the documents forgotten in her hands, the whole architecture of her careful distance dissolving around her like sugar in rain, when the bathroom door opened. Victor stepped out. He was in dark trousers and nothing else, a towel over one shoulder, and he had clearly had a drink. There was a glass on the bathroom shelf she could see through the open door, and there was the particular quality of a man who has been alone with alcohol and his own thoughts for some time, something drained and raw and unguarded that she had never seen on him in 11 days of meetings and professional civility. He saw her. He went absolutely still. For 3 seconds, neither of them moved. Neither of them breathed. Neither of them acknowledged the catastrophic specificity of this moment. Her, standing in his private room, having seen what was on his bed and his desk. Him, standing in the doorway of his bathroom, having nothing between him and this moment. No suit, and no carefully maintained distance, and no professional context to organize themselves behind. The storm threw lightning against the windows. Elena, he said. Just her name. The way he said it was different from every other time he'd said it in 11 days of measured professional contact. It was the way he'd said it 9 years ago, when they were alone, when there was nothing between them but honesty. She found her voice somewhere in the wreckage of her composure. "I have the wrong room," she said. "I was looking for your office." "It's across the hall," he said. "Yes," she said. She moved toward the door. He moved too, not dramatically, not rushing, simply placing himself between her and the exit with the unhurried inevitability of a man who has made a decision, and she stopped. "Don't," he said. His voice was very quiet. "Victor, don't pretend you didn't see it." The storm broke properly then, rain against the glass, thunder close enough to feel in the floor, and Elena stood in the dark of his bedroom with the shirt and the photographs burning in the corners of her vision, and felt the 10 years of carefully maintained distance crack open like ice in spring. He did not come closer. That was the thing she registered, standing in the lightning-interrupted dark of Victor Hale's bedroom, with the documents forgotten in her hands and her composure in pieces around her feet. He did not advance, did not press his advantage in the way a less disciplined man might have. He simply stood between her and the door, and looked at her, and the looking itself was its own kind of pressure. "Why?" she said, and the word came out smaller than she intended. He reached past her and turned on the lamp, the bedside lamp, which apparently was on a different circuit than the corridor lights, because it came to life and gave the room a low, warm light that was in some ways worse than the darkness, because now she could see him clearly, and he could see her, and there was nowhere for either of them to look that wasn't full of the thing they'd spent 11 days refusing to acknowledge. "Why what?" he said. "The photographs." She made herself say it. She gestured toward the bed, toward the shirt, and watched something move across his face, some subtle tectonic shift in the controlled surface. "You want an explanation," he said. "I want to understand what I'm looking at." He turned and looked at the desk, at the photographs she could see from here, candid shots, taken from distance, the kind of photographs produced by a telephoto lens. She recognized a street in Seattle, the coffee shop near her old office, the park she'd walked through on Sunday mornings. "Seattle," she said. Her voice was entirely steady, which she thought was impressive under the circumstances. "Yes." "For how long?" A pause. "Since the beginning," he said. "Since you left." She sat down on the edge of the chair near the bookshelf because her legs had decided to raise the issue, and she pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed. "Victor, I wasn't—" He stopped, looked at the window. "I wasn't watching you to control you, Elena. I wasn't interfering in your life. I just needed to know that you were safe, that wherever you were, whatever you'd built, it was intact." He paused. I couldn't stop. She thought about 9 years of Sunday mornings, of the park, of the coffee shop, of the life she'd constructed in Seattle with such painstaking care, and the idea that even in that carefully sealed-off world, she had not been entirely alone. She should have found it alarming. She wanted to find it alarming. "The shirt," she said. He said nothing. "You kept it all this time." Still nothing. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since her return without the protective shield of professional distance, and saw what she had been refusing to see for 11 days. Not just the 40-year-old man who had become something formidable and isolated, but the man she remembered underneath that, the man who had loved her with the same alarming totality she had loved him, who had never been any good at the things love requires people to be moderate about. "Why didn't you come after me?" she said, and the question surprised her as much as it might have surprised him, because she hadn't known she was going to ask it, hadn't known it was in her. He looked at her then. The raw, unguarded quality she'd seen when he first came out of the bathroom was still there, stripped of the usual armor. "Because Lucas asked me not to." "Lucas asked you—" "He said it would destroy you." His voice was very level. "He said if I went after you, if I pulled you back into this world, you'd spend the rest of your life watching people you loved die for choices you'd had no part in making. He said the kindest thing I could do was let you go." Elena was quiet for a very long time. "And you believed him," she said. "I hated him for it," Victor said, "but yes." Outside, the storm continued its argument with the windows. Inside, the lamp made a small, warm island of light in the center of which they sat. She on the chair, he standing by the desk, the photographs between them like evidence in a case that had never quite been closed. "I thought about you every day," she said, before she could stop herself. He went very still. "Every day," she said again, because if she was going to say it, she was going to say it properly. "In Seattle. In the hedge fund. At the coffee shop you apparently already knew about. Every single day for 9 years I thought about you. And every single day I told myself that it was fading, that I was moving on, that time was doing what people say time does." She stopped. "Time is a liar." Victor crossed the room in the silence that followed her words. Not fast, deliberately, the way he did everything, the way he had always done everything, with the focused attention of a man for whom speed was the last resort and precision was the first. He sat down on the edge of the desk, a few feet from her, and looked at her with something on his face that she had no name for, because she'd spent 9 years not allowing herself to maintain the vocabulary. "Elena," he said. "Don't," she said. "Don't what?" "Say my name like that. You know what you're doing when you say it like that." A pause. And then, very carefully, as though the word were something that could shatter. "Yes, I do." The storm outside made the windows rattle. They sat in the small, lamplit world of his bedroom, with everything unsaid between them growing enormous and present. And Elena looked at the man she had spent 9 years running from and understood, with the clarity that only comes when you finally stopped running, that you cannot outrun a thing that is inside you. "I should go," she said. "You should," he said. Neither of them moved. For 3 days after the bedroom encounter, Elena maintained the distance with a ferocity that she recognized as desperation wearing the clothing of discipline. She worked harder, stayed in meetings longer, gave Lucas analyses of such comprehensiveness that he began looking at her with a kind of concerned appreciation that she found exasperating. She ran longer in the mornings, ate properly, slept badly, answered emails from Seattle contacts with the attentiveness of a woman who was absolutely, entirely, not thinking about a shirt folded on a bed. Victor, for his part, maintained his own particular form of distance, which was, she understood now with a clarity she could have done without, the deliberate and conscious restraint of a man who was capable of enormous patience and had been exercising it for 9 years. He watched her. He always watched her. But he did not press, did not approach her outside of business context, did not say her name again in that particular way. The restraint itself was maddening. On the second day, she overheard him in the study with Marcus, discussing the security arrangements for an upcoming transfer of funds through the Meridian's private banking operation. She was passing in the corridor and she stopped, not to listen but because something in his voice caught her, some quality of the contained frustration she recognized, a tightness at the edges of his usual precision that she suspected only she would notice, only she knew the blueprint of him well enough to read. She walked on. On the third day, Lucas announced a dinner. Not a business dinner, not a meeting dressed as a meal, an actual dinner, with 4 guests he'd invited from among the old Chicago families who had been allied with the Wards for 2 generations. The kind of dinner that was social on the surface and political underneath, the kind that Elena had been navigating since she was 18. Victor was one of the 4. They sat across from each other at Lucas's dining table, between a property developer named Carver, whose wife laughed too loudly at everything, and an attorney named Sobieski, who had represented the Ward Group for 30 years, and had a magnificent and apparently deliberate deafness to anything he didn't want to hear. Lucas sat at the head, and the candlelight made everyone look like characters in a painting. And the wine was excellent, and Elena was brilliant, as she always was in these situations. Warm, precise, surprising people with the specificity of her recall. And Victor sat across from her and was all of these things too, because of course he was. He was funny, which she had forgotten. Not broadly funny, not the social performer kind of funny that some powerful men cultivated, but quietly funny. The kind that came out in one precise observation that restructured a whole conversation and made everyone around the table discover they were laughing. He did it twice, and both times she felt it in the place she'd been guarding, that helpless, involuntary warmth. She watched his hands on the stem of his wine glass and thought about the photographs on his desk and looked away. After dinner, on the terrace, while Lucas and Carver talked about a construction project, and Sobieski and his wife had drifted toward the garden, Victor came to stand beside her at the railing. Not close, appropriately distant for a terrace and a mixed gathering, with the lake dark and the city lit far away, and the cold, clean air of autumn between them. "You were quiet over dessert," he said. "I was listening," she said. A pause. Carver's expansion plan has a structural problem. The zoning variance he's assuming won't be granted. "I noticed," she said. "The council seat that would need to approve it flipped in August." He looked at her briefly, sideways, with a quality of amusement she'd always loved, private, quick, as though they shared something no one else in the room was in on. "You've been back 3 weeks," he said, "and you already know the August council seat." "I do my homework." "You always did." The words landed simply, not weighted with anything she could object to, and yet they were the most personal thing he'd said to her in public since her return, and they both knew it. She watched the lake and felt the cold and the warmth of his proximity, and the awareness of everything she was not going to do. "Victor," she said. "I know," he said, before she could continue. "You don't know what I was going to say." "Yes, I do. You were going to tell me that this needs to stay professional, that what happened in my room the other night shouldn't happen again, that we both understand the position we're in, and the people who would be affected, and the history we have, and the reasons it didn't work." A pause. "You've given that speech before, 9 years ago, nearly word for word." She turned to look at him properly and found him already looking at her, and the expression on his face was something she had no adequate word for. Not anger, not bitterness exactly, but something worn and patient and terribly, completely focused. "And 9 years ago," he said quietly, "I let you give it. I stepped back. I gave you the space you said you needed." His voice did not change in volume or inflection. "I am not going to tell you that was a mistake, because I understand why it happened, and I understand what Lucas feared, and I understand what you were trying to protect." He stopped. "But I am also not going to pretend, for your comfort or mine, that stepping back is something I'm willing to do again." The terrace was cold, and the lights of the distant city were very small, and the lake said nothing. "Victor," she said again. "I'm not going to rush you," he said. "I'm not going to corner you or make demands or give you an ultimatum. I'm going to tell you the truth and let you do what you'll do with it." He looked at the lake. "The truth is that I have loved you for 13 years, and I have waited for 9 of them, and I have run out of the kind of patience that pretends this is sustainable." Elena stood at the railing with the cold air on her face and her heart making itself known behind her breastbone with a rhythm that had nothing to do with composure. She said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would hold. He nodded, once, as though she'd answered him, and went back inside. The evening of the storm fell on a Friday. It had been building all day in the particular way of serious Lake Michigan weather, that creeping pressure drop, that greening of the light in the late afternoon, the water developing a character that went from restless to something that felt urgent and purposeful. By the time Elena finished her workday and ate a quiet dinner with Lucas, who had developed a cough that he was attributing to the autumn air and that she was observing with an attention she couldn't have explained yet, the storm had properly arrived. Wind against the east side of the house, rain horizontal. The kind of night that made the old stone of the Ward estate feel simultaneously like shelter and like a place the weather was trying to get into. Lucas had gone to bed early again, which he'd been doing with increasing frequency over the past week, each time with a slightly different explanation for why he was tired. She had noted this. She had filed it in the place where she kept things she wasn't ready to examine. At 9 o'clock, Marcus appeared at the door of her study. "Miss Ward?" Marcus was a man of about 60, gray-haired and solid, who had been with the family longer than Elena could remember, and who communicated everything in the same neutral tone, regardless of content. "Mr. Hale has asked for the Ricci preliminary terms before his morning call. He said the digital transfer was still down, and you'd have the physical copies." She looked at the manila envelope on her desk, which did in fact contain the Ricci preliminary terms, which she had been planning to scan and email to him first thing tomorrow morning, except that apparently the system was still having difficulties. His office, she said. Not his private office, yes, Marcus said. First door past the main sitting room in the east wing. Thank you, she said. She finished what she was working on, gathered the envelope, and made her way through the house to the east wing. The storm was louder here. The east wing faced the lake, and the windows were older, and the sound of the rain against them was continuous and enormous, punctuated by the crack and roll of thunder. First door past the main sitting room. She found it. The door was slightly ajar, lamplight visible within. She knocked. Come in. The office was everything the bedroom was not. Functional, efficient, organized in the way that suggested a mind that worked in structures, bookshelves with files rather than novels, a large desk with the controlled papers of ongoing work, 2 chairs across from it for meetings. A man's working space, unsentimental and precise. Victor was at the desk, in shirt sleeves and the dark trousers he'd been wearing earlier, reading something. He looked up when she entered, and his eyes did the thing they always did, that brief, complete inventory, and then he gestured to the desk. She crossed the room and put the envelope down. The Ricci terms, she said. Preliminary. You'll see I've attached the counter-offer matrix on the 3rd page. Thank you, he said. She turned to leave. Elena. A pause. There's a weather advisory. The storm's going to be significant through the night. There's a warning about the lake road. You shouldn't... I'm not going anywhere, she said. I'm staying in the estate. I know, he said. I know. She stopped at the door. The storm threw something against the window, a branch, the sound of it sudden and loud, and she turned instinctively, and the lights in the office went out. Not gradually, immediately, completely. The lamp, the ceiling fixture, all of it, and the only light was the intermittent white cracking of the lightning through the tall windows. A power outage, the kind a storm of this size was capable of, and the backup generator was apparently not responding, because the corridor she could see through the open door was equally dark. She stood in the dark office and heard Victor push back from his desk and stand. The generator's manual override is in the basement, he said. Marcus will sort it in a few minutes. Fine, she said. Lightning. In its light she saw him, standing on the other side of the desk, looking at her. The light was gone in a second, and the dark came back, and the storm made the windows sound like something desperate. Several minutes passed. The generator did not come back on. Victor, she said in the dark. I'm here, he said. His voice was nearby. He had come around the desk, was standing perhaps 5 feet from her, and she could hear him breathe in the spaces between the thunder. I want to tell you something, she said, because something about the dark and the storm and the weeks she'd spent not saying the real thing finally reached a tipping point. And what is a tipping point, if not the moment when the thing you've been holding becomes heavier than the effort of holding it? Then tell me, he said. I want you to know why I left. She heard her own voice and found it more even than she expected. I want you to know that it wasn't, that I wasn't, that the reason wasn't what you thought it was. A silence. The storm. What did I think it was? He said. I don't know. That I was afraid of the life. That I didn't want this world. That I thought I could find something better or cleaner or safer somewhere else. She stopped. None of that was true. I left because of you and Lucas. And I left because I was 22 and terrified. And I left because Lucas came to me and told me that if I stayed, if I chose you, he would leave the organization. He would walk away from everything he'd built with you. And I couldn't... Her voice, for the first time, wobbled. I couldn't let that happen. You needed him and he needed you, and I was the thing that was going to tear it apart. And I thought if I was the one who left, everyone I loved could be safe. The silence that followed this was different from all the previous silences. She heard him move. One step, and then another, and then he was close. Not touching, but close enough that in the dark she could feel the warmth of him, could smell the faint trace of the drink he'd had earlier, and beneath it the particular quality of his presence that she'd been cataloging without permission for weeks. Elena, he said. His voice was rough with something she'd never heard in it before. Do you have any idea what 9 years of not knowing that has cost me? Victor, do you know what I thought? What I spent 9 years thinking? His voice was still quiet, still controlled, but barely. I thought you chose a life without me because I wasn't worth the cost. Because when it came to it, what I was and what I came from was something you looked at clearly and decided wasn't what you wanted. No, she said. No, he repeated, like a door closing. No. And then his hands found her in the dark. Her face, both hands, his thumbs against her jaw, and she stopped breathing. 9 years, he said. You let me carry that for 9 years. I'm sorry, she whispered. The lightning came, and in its light she saw his face, inches from hers, everything he'd been holding contained in the sharp lines of his expression, the dark of his eyes. Elena, he said, is your heart made of stone? For 9 years you fled from me as if I were a plague, as if what we had was something to be sealed away and never opened. She felt the tears come before she could stop them, hot, sudden, breaking through 9 years of armoring. Because I love you. The words came out of her like something under pressure, finally released. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because if I stayed, you and my brother would have destroyed each other. I preferred to destroy myself rather than see you in danger. I preferred to grieve you alive than to put you in the position of choosing between a brotherhood that built everything you have and a woman who wasn't worth. He kissed her. Not gently, not cautiously. He kissed her the way a man kisses someone he has been starved of for 9 years and has just now, finally, been permitted to reach. Fierce and total, one hand in her hair and the other at her waist, and the storm making the whole world outside irrelevant. And Elena stopped thinking, and stopped managing, and stopped performing composure, because there was nothing left to perform composure for. She kissed him back. The tears were still on her face, and she could taste salt, and she didn't care, because after 9 years of exquisite, chosen deprivation, this was everything she remembered, and nothing she remembered, and more than anything she had permitted herself to want in a very long time. They stood in the dark office with the storm destroying itself against the windows, and 9 years of distance dissolved into the simple, enormous fact of being close. After. The storm continued outside. They were in the leather chairs by the unlit fireplace, she with her feet drawn up beneath her, he in the chair across, their knees almost touching, the dark between them now entirely different from the dark it had been an hour earlier. Someone had found candles. Victor, she thought. He had separated from her briefly and moved around the dark room and come back with a squat candle from the bookshelf and a lighter from his pocket. And in the small, warm circle of that light they sat and looked at each other with the specific combination of relief and terror that comes after you have done the irreversible thing, the thing you could not take back if you wanted to, the thing you have been trying not to do for 11 days and 9 years. Tell me about Seattle, he said. She looked at him. Why? Because I want to hear it from you, not from photographs. She thought about this. It was quiet, she said, finally. That was the thing I noticed first. After here, after this. She gestured vaguely at the house, the estate, the whole enormity of the world they both inhabited. Seattle is quieter. The pace is different. There's less pressure in the air. Did you like it? I learned to. She paused. I made a life. I was good at my work. I had friends. The kind you meet at brunches and wine bars, the kind who don't know your history. She looked at the candle flame. I was fine, Victor. I wasn't happy, but I was fine, and I told myself for 9 years that fine was what I'd chosen, and fine was what I deserved. You deserved more than fine, he said. I know that now. A silence. The storm moved through its argument outside. Tell me about the photographs, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I hired someone in the first year, just to confirm you'd arrived safely, that you were settled, that the new apartment was in a building with adequate security. He looked at his hands. After that first year, I told myself I'd stop, that knowing you were safe was enough. He stopped. I didn't stop. Victor, I know what it looks like. What does it look like to you? He was quiet again, and she could see him working through the honesty the way he always had, not avoiding it, because Victor had never been someone who avoided hard truths, but arriving at them with the deliberateness of someone who knew how much a truth can cost. It looks, he said, like a man who couldn't let go of the only thing that had ever made him feel like more than what he is. The candle burned between them. She moved her knee slightly. It touched his. He didn't move away. "Tell me about the ring," she said, because it had occurred to her while he was kissing her. A specific memory, clear and sudden, of an afternoon 13 years ago when they had walked through the Jewelers Row district on Wabash Avenue, and he had stopped in front of a small, independent shop, and she had asked him what he was looking at. He had said, "Nothing. An idea I have." She had been 20 at the time and had not known what that meant. She knew now what that meant. He said, very quietly, "How did you know about that?" "I didn't. I just remembered something, and I wondered." He looked at her for a long moment in the candlelight. "After you left," he said, "I had it finished. I'd commissioned it. There didn't seem to be a reason to stop." His voice was entirely steady, which was more affecting somehow than if it had broken. "It's been in my safe for 9 years. Victor, I'm not telling you this to... I'm not asking you to..." He stopped. "I just want you to know how long this has been true for me. I want you to have that information." Elena Ward, who had not wept in front of another person in 9 years, felt the heat behind her eyes and breathed carefully through it. "Say something," he said. "I don't know what to say." "Say anything." "I'm afraid," she said. "Not of you, of..." She looked at her own hands. "Of undoing what I built. Of what it costs if this goes wrong. Of what it costs if it goes right." She paused. "Of my brother." Victor's expression changed. Not much. His face had never been a broad canvas, but something moved through it. "Lucas," he said. "He loves you," she said. "He built everything with you. And he loves me in the way that men like Lucas love the people they've protected, like a possession they're terrified of losing." She looked at him. "If he finds out, when he finds out, it changes everything between you, again." "We're not 22 anymore," Victor said, "and I'm not willing to be the thing that disappears for the sake of other people's comfort." "That's easy to say tonight," she said. "It's easy to say because it's true." The candle between them had burned to its halfway point, and the storm was beginning to tire, its rage moving off to the east the way storms eventually move off, leaving the wrung-out calm of aftermath. Elena looked at the man across from her and thought about all the rooms they had sat in over 9 years that had not been the same room, all the distance that had been deliberate and had cost so much to maintain. "I'm not going to make any promises tonight," she said. "I'm not asking for promises," he said. "But I'm not going to lie to you either. I'm not going to tell you this isn't what it is." "What is it?" She looked at him, and for the first time in 11 days, for the first time in 9 years, she let him see exactly what was in her face. "It's 9 years overdue," she said. He reached across and took her hand, just held it, in the dark and the candlelight, his thumb moving once across her knuckles. Not a demand, not a claim. Just the simplest possible declaration of presence. Outside, the storm continued to quiet. The generators came back on. Light flooded the office, sudden and startling, and Elena blinked against it and felt the spell of the candlelit dark give way to something more ordinary and more frightening. The clarity of a lit room and a lit situation, and the fact that she was sitting in Victor Hale's private office at what was now nearly midnight, having kissed him and cried and held his hand. She sat up straighter. "I should go," she said. Victor looked at her with an expression that had composed itself, but retained, in the very back of his eyes, the echo of what the candlelight had contained. "Elena." "Lucas may be awake," she said. "If he comes looking..." "If he comes looking," Victor said, "we can tell him the truth." She looked at him, and the fear must have been visible in her face, because he exhaled and nodded, slowly, the nod of a man accepting something he disagrees with but understands. "Not yet," she said. I need time to think about how to approach this, how to say it to him." She paused. "You know how he is." "I know exactly how he is," Victor said. "He is one of the most stubborn, controlling, and loving people I've ever known, and the combination is not simple." "No," she said, "it isn't." She stood, smoothed her dress, found her equilibrium, which had been badly disrupted but was still available when she reached for it. He stood too, and for a moment they were close again in the restored light, and she had to make herself not reach for him. "I'll be careful," she said, which was a strange and insufficient thing to say, but which contained everything she meant, that she would not let what had just happened between them be reckless, would not let it become a bomb rolling toward the closest relationship she and Victor each had. "I know you'll be careful," he said. "You've been careful for 9 years." There was no accusation in it, or perhaps there was, and perhaps it was earned. She picked up her original documents, the Ricci terms, which had been the reason she'd come to the East Wing, which felt like they belonged to a different evening, and went to the door. "Elena," he said, one more time. She turned. He looked at her from across the clean, efficiently organized space of his office, and she could see the cost of what he was holding himself to. The restraint, the patience, the deliberate refusal to reach.
"I'm glad you came back," he said.
She left. She was in the corridor, walking back toward the main house, when she heard Lucas. His voice first, that distinctive baritone, carrying through the stone and plaster even when he thought he was speaking quietly, coming from the direction of the connecting corridor, perhaps 20 feet ahead of her, and approaching. Elena stopped. She was 15 feet from the door to Victor's office. She was standing in the corridor with the Ricci documents under her arm and her hair slightly disarranged, and she had been crying, which she was fairly sure her face still showed. The last thing, the very last thing, that could happen right now was Lucas finding her here, like this, with the East Wing at her back. She looked around. There was a doorway to her left, a secondary sitting room she remembered from childhood, dark and currently unoccupied. She could go in there, wait for Lucas to pass, emerge when the coast was clear. It was humiliating. It was exactly the kind of hiding she had done 9 years ago, sneaking out of Victor's company before her brother could see them together, stealing time in the gaps of other people's attentions. She hated it. She hated every molecule of it. But Lucas sounded as though he were having a serious conversation. She could hear the murmur of another voice, Marcus perhaps, and she needed to think before she faced her brother, and she was not ready to have this conversation tonight. She slipped into the sitting room. She had barely closed the door behind her when she heard Lucas's footsteps in the corridor, heavy, deliberate, heading toward the East Wing. She pressed her back against the doorframe and breathed. And then she heard the knock on Victor's office door, and she heard Victor answer, and she heard her brother say, "We need to talk about the Ricci arrangement." A pause, and then, "Come in." The door across the hall opened and closed. Elena stood in the dark sitting room with her hand pressed to the closed door and told herself she was not going to listen, that she was going to wait 3 minutes and leave quietly and go to her room and think about everything that had happened tonight in the appropriate privacy of her own space. But their voices carried, low and muffled through the old walls, and she was made of flesh and history and 9 years of deprivation, and she was not, in the end, made of stone. She pressed her ear to the door. She could hear them. Not clearly. The stone and plaster between her position and Victor's office rendered the voices inexact, the words dissolving at their edges into murmur. But the Ward estate had always had its acoustic oddities, and this particular sitting room had always been one of them. Something in the construction of the walls, some architectural quirk, made voices from the opposite office carry with a strange, watery clarity to anyone standing near the north wall. She moved to the north wall. Lucas was talking about the Ricci arrangement, which was the stated reason for his late-night appearance in the East Wing, and for a few minutes the conversation was about exactly what it said it was about: territories, financial structures, a timeline for the formal alliance. Business. The language of their world, the grammar she had grown up inside. Victor's responses were measured, specific, entirely professional, and she felt a private and complicated admiration for the complete absence of anything in his voice that would suggest what had occurred in this wing an hour ago. Then Lucas said something that changed the texture of the conversation. She pressed closer to the wall. "There's something else I need to say." Lucas's voice, stripped of the business register, dropping into something more private. "About Elena." Silence from Victor. "She's doing extraordinary work," Lucas said. "Better than I expected, which is saying something because I expected very good." A pause. "But I'm worried about her." "In what sense?" Victor said. "She's been gone a long time. 9 years is—" Lucas stopped, and she heard the cough she'd been noticing at dinner, the one he was dismissing. It came again, more pronounced. It's a long time for a person to be away from the only place they belong, and she came back looking like someone who has been carrying something very heavy and has gotten very good at pretending she isn't. He paused. I know why she left. I know what role I played in it. Another silence. Waited. Victor. Lucas's voice was different now, careful, the way he was when he was approaching something he had thought about for a long time. I know you were watching over her in Seattle. Elena stopped breathing. I know, Lucas said again. I've known for years. Marcus keeps track of things I ask him to keep track of, and I asked him to keep track of whether you were watching over her or... I needed to know she was being protected, even if she didn't know it. A pause. I want you to know that I'm grateful for it, that I've always been grateful. Victor said very quietly, Lucas, let me finish. Another cough, worse this time, longer. When it resolved, Lucas's voice was rougher. I have something I need to tell you, and I have been putting it off for the better part of a year, and I am aware that putting it off has not been kind to either of us. Elena had gone perfectly still against the wall. Cold. Something cold had opened in her chest. I'm ill, Lucas said. I've been ill for about 14 months. The doctors have a name for it, which I will not repeat, because I find medical terminology for one's own condition to be insufferable. But the practical information is this. I have, on the optimistic end of the estimates, perhaps 18 months. On the realistic end, less. The silence that followed was so complete that Elena could hear the rain still tapping against the windows of the dark sitting room she stood in. Lucas, Victor said. His voice was not steady, and the lack of steadiness told her everything about what this information was costing him. I don't want your... Don't do whatever you're about to do. Don't... Lucas, managing emotion by refusing it admission, the most Ward family response imaginable. I need you to listen, not react. A pause, then, I'm listening. I brought Elena back, Lucas said, because I need someone to inherit the operational side, someone the family trusts, someone competent enough to keep what we've built from becoming something worse in the wrong hands. She's the only one I trust with that. He paused. But I also brought her back because I have been watching her for 9 years, from a distance, and she has been fine and competent and successful and not once, not ever, in any report Marcus has given me or any conversation I've had with her, does she sound like someone who is living the life they actually want. He stopped. I did that to her. I sent her away and I told her it was for her protection. And the truth is, it was half for her protection and half because I was afraid of losing both of you to each other. Victor said nothing, which was the right thing because there was nothing to say. I don't have infinite time anymore, Lucas said, to make the things I got wrong less wrong. His voice was very controlled, and the control was the most heartbreaking part of it. So I'm telling you this. Whatever you feel for my sister, and I am not asking you to tell me because I already know, I want you to know that I am not going to stand in the way of it this time. I want her to have everything she chose not to have when she chose to protect us. He stopped. She should not spend another 9 years living half a life because of what I asked of her. Elena, in the sitting room, had one hand over her mouth. She was shaking. Not dramatically, just a tremor in her hands, a looseness in her knees, the physical expression of a heart that had just been cracked open in 2 directions simultaneously. Her brother was dying. Her brother had known about Victor all along. Her brother, who had spent 9 years coughing and managing and reducing himself to a business agenda at family dinners, had been carrying both of these things in the same hands that had held all of it. The empire, the alliance, the careful preservation of the one family he had left. Victor, Lucas said, my sister loves you. She has always loved you. And you love her with a degree of... He made a sound that might have been almost laughter. It's frankly disproportionate, but I've come to understand that some things are. Victor said, in a voice she had never heard from him, Lucas. Go to bed, Lucas said. I'm going to bed. We'll talk more tomorrow. Footsteps, the sound of a chair, the door across the hall opening. Elena flattened herself against the sitting room wall, and Lucas's footsteps passed in the corridor, moving away, the sound of him retreating. And under the sound of the retreating footsteps, she could hear it, the cough returning, persistent and deep. She stood in the dark sitting room for a long time after his footsteps had faded. She came out of the sitting room. She came out into the corridor, which was now quiet and lit and entirely empty, and she stood in it for a moment, as though waiting for the walls to offer some instruction. They did not. The walls of the Ward estate, she had always found, were not particularly forthcoming. She crossed the corridor and knocked on Victor's office door. "Come in," he said, and then, when she entered and he saw her face, "How long have you been—" "Long enough," she said. She watched him process this, watched him understand what she'd heard, watched the implications of that understanding move through his expression in a way that was too complex and too quick to follow entirely. He was still standing where he'd been when Lucas left, not having moved. She could tell by the angle of his body, the slight tension at the shoulders. "Elena," he said. She crossed the room and sat down in the chair she'd vacated an hour ago, and pressed both hands flat on her knees and looked at the candle that had now burned to almost nothing in its dish. "He's dying," she said. "Yes. You knew." A pause. "I suspected. There were signs for the past year. Fatigue, weight, the way he's been distributing authority. I didn't have confirmation. And now you do. And now I do." She sat very still. Outside, the storm had reduced itself to soft rain, the kind that was almost peaceful, that cleaned things rather than breaking them. "Tell me you're not going to do something," she said. "What do you mean?" "Tell me you're not going to step back from me again because of him, because of the time he has left, because you think it's—" She stopped. "Tell me you're not about to be noble." Victor looked at her for a long moment. "Elena, he just told me he wants me to—" "I know what he told you," she said. "I was there. I heard it too." She looked at him. "I've spent 9 years doing things because of what I thought was right for the people around me, and not doing things because of what I thought would hurt them. I've been very responsible and very careful and very, very good at putting other people first." Her voice was level, and she was very proud of it. "And my brother is dying, Victor, and I don't have infinite time anymore either. None of us do. And I don't know what the right answer is. I don't know if there is a right answer. But I know I'm done letting fear make all my decisions." He crossed the room and sat on the desk's edge, close to her, and looked at her with that complete, focused attention she had been cataloging for 11 days and had been avoiding the implications of for 9 years. "I'm not stepping back," he said. "Good," she said. "But we have to think about how we approach Lucas. Not to hide from him. Those days are finished, but because he's the most important person in both our lives, and he just told us something enormous, and—" "I know," she said. "I know." They sat with that knowledge between them. The small candle flickered its last. She looked at him in the electric light that had replaced it, cleaner, more ordinary, more real, and thought about her brother in his bed in the north wing, coughing in the dark. Thought about the shirt on the pillow. Thought about Seattle and the photographs and 9 years of careful unhappiness. "Victor," she said. "Yes." "Don't, tonight, just—" She looked at him. "Don't let me go to bed alone, having heard all of that." He stood and held out his hand, and she took it, and it was exactly as simple and as complicated as everything between them had always been. She woke before dawn in a chair in Victor's sitting room, not the bedroom, not the office, but the connecting sitting room between them where they had talked until 3 in the morning, talked in the way she imagined prisoners talk after years of silence, drinking everything, saying the things that had accumulated and needed to be said, the history and the grief and the particular black comedy of 2 people who had loved each other across 9 years of deliberate distance. He had covered her with his jacket at some point, and she didn't know when she'd fallen asleep, but she had, with the particular depth of someone who has been expending a great deal of emotional energy and whose body has finally issued a non-negotiable demand. He was still there, in the other chair, awake, watching her with an expression she caught before he could compose it, an expression of such open, uncomplicated love that she had to look away from it for a moment because it was too large. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," he said. She took stock of herself. Yesterday's dress, which had survived remarkably well, her hair escaped from its pins, the remnants of last night's emotion having settled into something steadier. She felt, for the first time in years, the way a person feels when they have taken something they've been carrying very carefully and finally put it down. Lighter, unsteadier on their feet, but lighter. "Lucas," she said. "Is probably awake," Victor said. "He's always up by 6. She looked at the pale suggestion of dawn coming through the east window. "I need to go see him." "I know." I'm not going to tell him, not today. I need to see him. I need to see my brother." Victor nodded. There was something careful in his expression, a holding back of whatever he himself needed, the grace of someone who understood that some things are not about them, and who was making room accordingly. She gathered herself, smoothed the dress, went to the small mirror on the sitting room wall, and examined the damage. She would need a change of clothes before breakfast. She would need to look like someone who had slept in her room, and not in a chair in the east wing. She was not proud of the continuance of concealment, but she gave herself this morning, one morning, to arrive at Lucas's reality before announcing her own. Victor had gone to his bedroom briefly and returned with a hand towel and a glass of water and a small pot of the face cream she used. She stared at that last item. "I noticed what you used in Seattle," he said, entirely unapologetically. "I keep it." She pressed 2 fingers to her forehead. "Victor." "I know," he said. She used the face cream and the water and looked somewhat more like herself, and when she was satisfied, he walked her to the door of the East Wing corridor. "This afternoon," she said. "I'll be here," he said. She went. Lucas was in the garden. She found him there at 6:15, on the stone bench at the lake's edge that had been his thinking spot since he was a young man and their father was still alive, and the world had been a different set of problems. He was in a thick coat, his breath visible in the cold air, looking at the water with the expression of a person who has had a long and complicated night. She sat beside him without speaking. They looked at the lake together. The water was calmer now, the storm's evidence limited to the fresh-turned scent of the air and some debris on the shore, and the sky was doing the thing Chicago autumn skies sometimes did in the aftermath of weather, going very clear, very pale, very ruthlessly beautiful. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said. "Neither do you," she said. A pause. "Lucas," she said, "I need you to tell me about being ill." He turned to look at her. She looked back. In his face she could see it now, the thing she'd been noting without naming, that excavation, that interior something working on him. How had she not seen it immediately? Because you see what you expect to see, and she had not expected to return to Chicago and find her brother diminished. He did not ask how she knew. He simply looked at her for a long moment and then looked back at the lake. "I was going to tell you," he said. "I know. I was working up to it. I wanted you settled back in first. Wanted you—" "Lucas." She took his hand, his large, cold hand. "Tell me." He told her. The name of it, finally. The full name, the medical name, the thing he'd been calling it in his own head for 14 months. He told her about the diagnosis, about the treatment he'd already tried, about the current prognosis, about the plan he had in place for the organization, about the lawyers and the documents and the succession structure he'd been quietly building. He talked for a long time, and she listened with her hand in his and looked at the lake. When he finished, the sun had come up, pale and clear, over the water. "Elena," he said, "I'm sorry I pushed you away from Chicago. I'm sorry I asked you to." He stopped. "I thought I was protecting you. I know it cost you." "It cost both of us," she said. "Yes." He looked at their joined hands. "I want the time I have left to be... I want things to be right between us. All of us." "They will be," she said. She sat beside her dying brother in the morning light and felt the grief come, not explosively, not dramatically, but with the slow and final authority of a tide. The weeks that followed were complex in the way of all things that are beginning and ending simultaneously. The Ward Group's operations continued their demanding rhythm. The Ricci Alliance moved to its formal stages. The Lakeview account discrepancies were formally addressed with a directness that left Castellano's associates in no position to deny them. The legal structure of the succession plan that Lucas had begun building was quietly accelerated by an attorney who understood exactly what kind of discretion was required. Elena worked. She had always worked hard, but there was something additional now, an urgency, a desire to get it right, to understand every thread of the organization with sufficient precision that nothing would fall through the gaps when Lucas was no longer there to hold the center. Lucas worked too, less than he had, but with more deliberation, as though he were choosing which of the 1,000 things in his empire deserved the diminishing resource of his attention. He slept more. His cough was worse on cold mornings. He was, Elena noticed, lighter than he had been when she arrived. Not lighter in the way she'd been the night before the confessions, but physically lighter, the weight loss that attends illness. She watched him with the careful, unobtrusive attention that was becoming one of the primary emotional activities of her days. And she and Victor. They did not hide exactly, but they were careful. They were careful in the way that people are careful when they are protecting something new and fragile from conditions that might damage it. Not ashamed, not concealed, but private. They talked. They had developed the habit of talking, of filling in the 9 years with specifics and texture, of learning each other again from the foundations and finding that the foundations had not moved. She learned things about him she hadn't known, that he'd taken over the full operational leadership of the Chicago organization at 32, 2 years after she'd left, and that the process of building that leadership had cost him things he rarely talked about. That he kept a piano in his rooms in the city penthouse and played it badly and stubbornly, which she found disproportionately endearing. That he'd read every book on a shelf in the bedroom she'd seen on the night of the storm, had read most of them twice. He learned things about her, that she'd almost left Seattle for London 3 years in, had been offered a position in a financial firm that would have meant a complete severance from everything American, and had turned it down for a reason she hadn't examined at the time. That she'd spent years in a book group that read exclusively European novels, which had been, she admitted, a very elaborate form of nostalgia for a world adjacent to the one she'd left. That she'd kept one of his early texts, from before she left, from the early days when they'd been trying to be secret and had failed at it spectacularly, kept it in a folder on her phone through every upgrade and every new device, transferred again and again. "What does it say?" he asked. "It says, I'm at the Meridian Bar. Come if you want. Don't come if you don't. Either way, I'll be thinking about you." He was quiet. "That's the most Victor Hale sentence I've ever read," she said. He actually laughed, genuinely, fully, the laugh she'd remembered and found again to her relief, still intact under the decade of gravity he'd accumulated. It transformed his face the way it always had, opening everything that was usually contained, and she looked at him laughing and felt something in her chest that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with gratitude. They were in his rooms at the Meridian, the penthouse he maintained above the hotel, which was extraordinary in the specific way of spaces that are designed for one person's particular requirements. Spare and clean and full of the best version of every necessary thing, with the city spread below the floor-to-ceiling windows in 3 directions. She had been here twice now. He had shown her the piano, an upright, slightly battered, incongruous in the clean modern space, and played her 3 bars of something badly, and she had laughed too. "Lucas knows," she said, after the laughter had settled, "or suspects. He told me as much the other night." Victor looked at the city below the window. "He wants—" "I know what he wants." She looked at her hands. "He wants to know that I'll be okay. After." She swallowed. "He's always seen you as the one person who—" She stopped. "Who what?" "Who would walk into fire for me," she said. "He told me once, years ago, before everything, that the terrifying thing about Victor Hale is that he is absolutely capable of complete commitment and absolutely incapable of being turned from it once committed." She paused. "He said it as a warning. He may have also been saying something else." Victor turned to look at her. "He was saying something else," he confirmed. Outside, November Chicago made its gray and golden case against the windows. She thought about her brother in his study at the estate, managing his diminishment with the authority he applied to everything. She thought about the organization she was helping build a future for. She thought about the life she had in Seattle that was already beginning to feel like a set of someone else's furniture. "I'm not going back to Seattle," she said. Victor said nothing. "I mean, my apartment, my things, the contract. I need to officially... There are practical matters, but I'm not going back to live there. She looked at the city. This is where I'm from. This is where I... She stopped. I kept telling myself I was from somewhere else, that I'd built something somewhere else. But a city is just an address, and belonging is a different thing. Where do you belong? He asked. She looked at him. Here, she said, and meant the city, and also meant the room, and also meant the specific configuration of the present moment, and was fairly sure he understood all three. He moved to her side at the window, and they stood together, with Chicago below them and the lake in the distance doing what it always did. And he put his arm around her shoulders, and she let herself lean against him, and it was the most ordinary thing, the simplest thing, and it cost the whole of 9 years to arrive at. November deepened. The Ward estate settled into its winter character, the gardens stripped, the trees bare against the gray sky, the lake showing its teeth. Lucas's health was increasingly visible in the careful way it always becomes visible at a certain point, the way illness makes a claim on the surface of a person, regardless of their desire to keep it private. Elena had fallen into a routine. She ran in the mornings, worked long days, had dinner with Lucas 3 or 4 times a week, the dinners lengthening as they both seemed to understand that the hours between them had a new value. They talked, more than they had ever talked, she thought, than perhaps at any point in their adult lives, about the business and about the past, and occasionally about the future, in the oblique way that people with a difficult future talk about it. She and Victor were an open secret that neither of them had formally declared. Lucas knew and said nothing, and watched them with an expression she was beginning to be able to read, something between relief and a grief that had nothing to do with disapproval. On the last Wednesday of November, Elena came down to breakfast to find Victor already there. This was not unusual. He had been eating breakfast at the estate with increasing frequency, which Lucas was permitting with a pointed lack of comment that constituted, for Lucas Ward, the equivalent of a blessing. What was unusual was that he was alone, and looked as though he had been alone with something for several hours. "You're here early," she said, sitting across from him. "Couldn't sleep," he said. She poured coffee and looked at him. He was in the charcoal suit he wore when he meant business. Tie actually nodded for once, which meant either a significant meeting or a significant internal state. "What is it?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Come to the Meridian tonight," he said. "All right," she said. "Why?" "Because I need to. There's something I've been carrying in my safe for 9 years, and I can't carry it any longer." He looked at his hands, which was unusual for him. Victor rarely looked at his hands in anything other than anger or decision. This was different. "I made a promise to myself when you left. I told myself that if you ever came back, if the world ever managed the necessary reorganization to put you back in the same city as me, I would not be the man who let it happen again without saying the thing that needed to be said." "Victor," she said. "I'm not going to say it here," he said, with the trace of something that was almost, improbably, sheepish. "At the Meridian, tonight, 8 o'clock. She looked at him across the breakfast table of the estate in which they had both, in different ways, been circling each other for a month and for 9 years. 8 o'clock, she said. He nodded and picked up his coffee, and they ate breakfast in the companionable silence of 2 people who are carrying something enormous together and have decided not to put it down yet. She wore red. She did not usually wear red. It was not a color she reached for, being more of a charcoal and cream person by inclination. But she had a red dress she'd brought from Seattle on impulse, a deep wine red with a draped neckline and a silhouette that was quiet and severe until you moved, and she put it on and looked at herself in the mirror and thought, yes. The Meridian's penthouse was different at night. The city below was all lit gold and shadow, the lake a dark presence beyond, the skyline doing its best work in the dark the way Chicago always did. Victor was waiting. She heard the piano as she came through the penthouse entrance, and she stopped to listen for a moment before making her presence known, because he was playing something she hadn't heard before, slow and not quite right at the fingering, but recognizably something rather than nothing. She stepped into the main room. He stopped playing. He stood. He was in black, all black, the kind of suit that had always looked as though it had been designed specifically for him because it had, and he looked at her with the expression she was learning not to brace against, the open, direct, complete attention. "Red," he said.
Don't, she said. I wasn't going to say anything.
"You had a whole sentence forming." "I did," he acknowledged. He crossed the room to her and stopped at the appropriate distance, and then, apparently deciding that the appropriate distance was not the distance he wanted, came the rest of the way. "I need to show you something before dinner," he said. He turned to the bookshelf behind the piano. She saw now it was a section of false shelf, a concealed panel, and opened it to reveal a small safe. He dialed the combination with the practiced ease of a man who has done it thousands of times, and when the door opened, he reached inside and removed a box. Red velvet, small. He turned and placed it on the piano lid and looked at her. "Victor," she said, and her voice was very even, which required effort.
I had this made, he said, 13 years ago, when we were... before. I had it made because I knew, the way I know things that I don't need to wait for evidence on, that you were it for me. That everything before you was prelude, and everything after was going to be about whether I was ever brave enough or fortunate enough to be in the same room as you without having to hide it." He stopped. He opened the box. Inside, a ring. Not ostentatious, not the kind that announces itself. A single stone, dark sapphire, the color of the lake in November, set in white gold, clean and perfect, and clearly made for a specific person's hand. "I didn't commission it for an occasion," he said. "I commissioned it because it needed to exist, because I needed there to be an object in the world that said, 'This is real. This was always real.'" He looked at her. "I've been carrying it in my safe for 9 years. I didn't know if I'd ever get to show it to you." Elena looked at the ring and then at the man who had kept it in his safe through a decade of absence and photographs from a distance and a shirt folded on a bed, and she felt everything that she was move toward him in a way that was beyond argument. "I'm not asking you tonight," he said. "I mean..." He stopped, and she saw the emotion working on the surface of that usually controlled face, something raw and uncertain and very young. "I want to ask you properly. When the time is right, when Lucas..." He stopped again. "I want to be able to ask you in a way that doesn't have grief attached to it. You deserve better than grief attached to it." She stepped forward and closed the velvet box gently with both hands. "Victor," she said, "you already know my answer." He looked at her. "But I'll let you ask," she said. And she leaned up and kissed him, there beside his badly played piano, with the city brilliant below the windows, and the ring sat in its box on the piano lid, and the world continued its complicated revolutions. The conversation with Lucas happened on a Thursday morning in December, 12 days after the evening at the Meridian. Elena had decided that waiting, while understandable, while having 100 practical justifications, was itself a form of dishonesty, and she had spent enough of her life managing the feelings of others by withholding her truth. Lucas deserved the truth. Lucas, who had sat on the bench beside the lake and told her everything, who had stood in Victor's office on the night of the storm and said the things he'd been carrying for a year. Lucas deserved the full, direct, unmediated version of his sister. She went to his study at 9 o'clock, which was his most functional time of day, when the morning medication had done its work and before the fatigue of the afternoon set in. He was at the desk with a coffee and a set of documents that were, she recognized, the formal succession materials. "Elena," he said, looking up. "I need to tell you something," she said. He looked at her face and set the documents down. She sat across from him, the familiar configuration of the Ward family study, the two of them on opposite sides of a desk that had belonged to their father, with the lake visible through the window behind his chair. "Victor and I," she said. She did not soften it or approach it obliquely or give him the version that was built for consumption. She told him the truth, what had been building since her return, what had happened the night of the storm, what had been growing since. She told him about the ring and what it meant and what she intended. Lucas sat very still through all of this. When she finished, the study was quiet. He looked at the window, at the lake. "Elena," he said, "I know you have feelings about..." "I love you," he said, which was not what she'd expected. Not preamble, not condition, just that, directly, the way Lucas said things when he'd decided to stop managing them. "I love you more than I've done right by, and I made choices for you when I should have asked you what you wanted, and I spent years telling myself it was for your protection." He stopped. Victor loves you. He loves you with the kind of stubborn, relentless, completely disproportionate devotion that I find simultaneously admirable and slightly terrifying. And he has loved you through 9 years of absence without any particular reason to hope. And if I were a woman who wanted to be loved like that, I would want to be loved like that by him. She said nothing for a moment. That, she said, is the most honest thing you've said to me in 30 years. I know, he said. I've been practicing. He looked at her with the full weight of everything he carried in his face, the authority, the illness, the love, the knowledge of his own mistakes. I want you to be happy. I want the time I have left to be full of you being happy. I want to watch you and Victor sit at this table and argue about operations, and look at each other when they think I'm not looking. And I want to find it embarrassing, which I will, and also entirely right, which it is. Elena felt the tears come for the second time since her return. This time, she didn't hold them. She stood and went around the desk, and her brother stood and they embraced. A real embrace, not the 2-second territorial version of his greeting at the front steps, but the embrace of two people who have been managing their love for each other through management structures and executive decisions, and finally decided to just be siblings. He held on for longer than she expected. When he let go, he held her at arm's length and looked at her face in the way she'd been looked at since childhood. The assessment, the inventory, but with something different in it now, something that was just love, unqualified. Tell him to come to dinner, Lucas said. Tonight. No business agenda, just dinner. She smiled. He'll be suspicious. Good, he's been too comfortable lately. She laughed, and it was the laugh of relief, the specific laugh of a person who has been carrying something and has now, finally, put it down. Dinner that evening was the best meal Elena had eaten in the Ward estate in 9 years. Lucas was at his most deliberate, which in his case meant funny and precise and willing to be wrong occasionally if being wrong made the conversation better. Victor, given explicit permission to be present without the business agenda, was revelatory. She watched him settle into the table with a kind of ease she'd never seen in a professional context, and thought, this is who he is when no one needs anything from him. He was funnier here too, that quiet, restructuring humor. And twice he and Lucas fell into the easy shorthand of men who have worked beside each other for 20 years, and found, in the gaps between the shorthand, something that was unmistakably friendship. She watched them and felt the full weight of what had been nearly lost, what the 9 years of her absence had nearly permanently broken. Both men, without her, Lucas managing his organization and his illness with the isolated dignity of someone who permits no assistance. Victor watching photographs from a distance, keeping a shirt on a bed. They were better together, all three of them. She had always known it. She had spent 9 years knowing it. After dinner, when Lucas had excused himself to rest, and she and Victor were clearing the table in the companionable way that had developed between them, he looked at her over the width of the dining table. He approved, he said. He did more than approve, she said. How much more? He said you love me with a degree of disproportionate devotion that he finds admirable and slightly terrifying. Victor considered this. That is an accurate assessment, he said. She laughed, and he came around the table and kissed her in the dining room of the Ward estate, with the lights bright and the door open and no curtains to hide behind, and it was, she thought, a remarkably good start. December moved with a particular slowness in the Ward estate, the kind of slowness that comes not from idleness, but from the heightened awareness of people who know that the hours have changed in value. Elena organized her life with the efficiency she applied to everything. She had flown to Seattle for 4 days to close her apartment, to collect the things that were actually hers, rather than the furniture of a life she'd been inhabiting, to say goodbye to the colleagues who had mattered, and the apartment with its view of the water that was not Lake Michigan, and its Sunday morning park. She'd stood in the empty Seattle apartment before she left, in the clean gray light, and had waited to feel whatever she'd expected to feel. Grief, perhaps, or the particular morning of closing a chapter. What she felt instead was clarity, the clean, precise feeling of a person who has made the right decision and knows it.
She flew back to Chicago with 2 suitcases and a carry-on, and for the first time in 9 years, cleared customs at O'Hare without the subterranean terror of a woman approaching a thing she'd told herself she could no longer have. Lucas met her at the estate's front door. He looked worse than she'd left him 4 days earlier. The cold had deepened the cough, and there was a transparency to his face now in the winter light that was new, the translucence that comes when weight continues to diminish below the point of disguise. He stood in the doorway with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at her with the expression that was becoming characteristic, that mixture of authority and tenderness that age and illness had allowed to coexist in him. "Welcome home," he said. "Don't start," she said. "I'm not starting anything. I'm merely observing that you left Chicago with a suitcase 9 years ago, and you've returned with 2, which represents a net gain, and I find that encouraging." She hugged him on the doorstep, and he allowed it, and she felt his thinness under the coat, and filed it in the place where she was keeping all the evidence of his diminishment, keeping it carefully, with the attention of someone who was not yet ready to open the file and read it all at once. The week before Christmas, the ward group held its annual formal event at the Meridian. It was an event Elena had attended many times before her 9-year absence, a gathering of the organization's legitimate side leadership, their partners and allies, and the political connections that formed the visible layer of what the wards had built. Held in the Meridian's grand ballroom, 40 floors up, with the city displaying itself through floor-to-ceiling glass, and the waitstaff moving with the choreographed efficiency of very expensive training. This year it was different. This year Elena came as herself, not as Lucas's assistant or the returning sister or the competent financial analyst who kept her feelings in a sealed container. She came in a dress of deep green, and she came knowing who she was in that room, knowing that her presence was no longer temporary. She came with Victor at her side. Not dramatically, not with any announcement or performance. They arrived together, which was noted by everyone who needed to note it, and they moved through the room as people who are at ease with each other move through rooms, and the only thing that was announced was their comfort. Lucas noticed. Lucas was across the ballroom when they arrived, and she watched him see them, and watched the expression on his face do the thing she'd described to Victor. The admiration and the slight, private terror, and underneath both of those, the simple, open pleasure of a man watching his 2 favorite people in their right configuration. The evening was beautiful. She danced. She had not danced in Chicago in 9 years, and the band was excellent, and Victor, who moved with the same deliberate precision he applied to everything, was better than she'd expected. "You've been practicing," she said. "I have," he said, without embarrassment. "When?" "Since I knew you were coming back." She looked at him. "Victor." "Yes?" "Nothing," she said. "Just, yes." He turned her into a slow spin and brought her back, and she was aware of Lucas watching from near the window, and Marcus watching from near the door, and the whole of the room doing the discreet observation that people in these circles were trained to do, and she didn't care about any of it. The ballroom, the city below, the man with his hand at her back. This was what remaining looked like. This was the thing she'd been afraid to claim. This was worth the 9 years, not because the 9 years were acceptable, but because their ending was. Later that night, after the event wound down and the guests dispersed, and Lucas had been taken home by Marcus with a discretion that broke her heart slightly, she and Victor stood on the Meridian's highest terrace, the city below, the lake beyond it. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking," she said, "that the last time I stood somewhere high above Chicago was the night I left. I was at the airport, standing at the gate, looking back at the skyline through the terminal windows." She paused. "I remember thinking that I'd come back someday, when it was safe, when the thing that needed not to be risked was no longer in danger." "And is it?" he said. "Is it safe now?" She considered the question with all the honesty she had. "No," she said, "but I've stopped needing it to be." He took her hand. Below them, Chicago continued its brilliant, merciless, constant performance. Christmas at the Ward estate was, in the old tradition, a larger event than its domestic setting might suggest.
Lucas had always kept Christmas with the particular intensity of a man who had learned to treat the calendar as something to be honored rather than merely observed. The decorations were elaborate, the table extended for a dinner that included Marcus and 3 longtime staff members and 2 cousins Elena barely knew who had been invited because Lucas had, in his illness, apparently been reviewing his relationships and finding the ones that needed attending to. Victor was there. He was there openly, at the table, on the right side of Lucas in the seat that had occasionally been left empty in previous Christmases, as though awaiting occupancy. He ate and drank and argued with Lucas about 2 separate business matters with the frank pleasure of men who argue because they respect each other and argued as she remembered them arguing in the early days, before her leaving had introduced a chill, with humor and ferocity and the underlying trust of people who have built something together and know its worth. She sat across from him and watched the 2 men who constituted her family eat Christmas dinner at the table where she'd eaten Christmas dinner as a child, and felt a grief that was not grief exactly, a fullness that was not quite happiness, something between the two, something that occupied the specific register of the present tense when you know the present tense is not limitless. After dinner, when the table had been cleared and the cousins had said their goodbyes and Marcus had escorted them out and the estate had settled into the quiet of a house with 3 people and a fire and the deep cold of December outside, Elena and Lucas sat in the study, the old way, while Victor was in the east wing on a call he'd apologized for needing to take. "Are you in pain?" she asked. "Not at the moment," he said, which was probably not entirely true, but which she accepted. "Lucas, I want to know when it's... I want you to let me be there. When things..." She stopped. "Elena," he said gently, "I know that sounds... It doesn't sound like anything except what it is," he said. "You wanting to be present for me, which is... Yes, I want that." A pause. "I want a lot of things I spent years not saying I wanted." He looked at the fire. "I want you and Victor to be all right. I want the organization to stay what we built it to be, rather than what it could become without the right people making the right decisions. I want..." He stopped, and the cough interrupted him, and she waded through it, and when it resolved, his face was tired. "I want more time," he said, quietly, and it was the most unguarded statement he had ever made in her presence, and it cost him something visible to make it. She crossed to his chair and sat on the arm of it, the way she'd done as a child, and leaned against him. "We'll make it count," she said. He put his arm around her, and they sat in front of the fire, and outside the snow had started, Chicago's first real snow of the year, coming down in the dark against the windows. Victor found them there an hour later and stopped in the doorway, reading the room with the precision he read everything, and then came quietly and took the chair across from the fire and sat with them, and the 3 of them were in the warm study with the snow outside and the fire between them. Lucas fell asleep in his chair. Elena looked at Victor across her brother's sleeping form. He looked back, and in his face was everything, the sorrow of it and the beauty of it, the complexity of this December moment, and the clarity of what they had arrived at inside the complexity. She mouthed, "Thank you." He shook his head, as though thanks were beside the point. Perhaps it was. She looked at her brother, asleep in the firelight, diminished and present and exactly himself, and she thought, this is what it means to be home. Not the arrival, not the declaration, this. The fire and the snow and the people you love and the ordinary miracle of the same room. She held on to the moment with both hands. The new year arrived, and January moved through Chicago with the particular brutality the city reserved for January. Cold that was not metaphorical, wind off the lake that felt personal, the sky a white that was indistinguishable from absence of sky. Lucas's condition was more difficult in January. Not catastrophically, not the final turn, not yet, but visibly more difficult, the good days becoming shorter and the difficult mornings more frequent. He had reduced his active involvement in the organization to 3 or 4 key matters, and had been, Elena observed with complicated admiration, working with remarkable intention on the things he still touched, as though illness had given him the gift of clarity about what actually mattered, and he was using the gift with full awareness. The ward group's operations were running well. Elena had found, in the months since her return, that she was good at this, not merely competent, not merely adequate to the task, but genuinely, specifically, in her bones, good at the structures of the organization, at seeing the whole and the parts simultaneously, at the quality of authority that a room of strong men would accept because it was real and not performed. Victor had told her this in November, privately, with the bluntness he reserved for things he wanted her to hear without decorative caveats. She had argued with him for 20 minutes on principle, and then stopped arguing because he was right. In February, two things happened. The first was Lucas's formal transition of operational leadership to Elena and Victor jointly, a document he had prepared with the attorneys over months, signed in the study with Marcus as witness, in the quiet way that Lucas Ward did important things. No ceremony, no speech. He signed the papers and handed them to Elena and looked at her with the expression that was increasingly his signature and said, "Take care of it," which meant everything he had always meant and always would mean. The second thing was Victor. It happened on a Sunday in mid-February, the kind of Sunday that Chicago produces occasionally in February, as though to remind you that it hasn't forgotten warmth entirely. Bright, the lake actually glittering in a pale, low sun, the temperature still brutal, but the light compensating. Victor picked her up at 10 in the morning. He was in a dark coat she hadn't seen before, and he looked, she noted, somewhat less composed than usual, which was itself notable because Victor's level of composure was such that somewhat less represented a significant departure. "Where are we going?" she said. "You'll see," he said. He drove north along the lake, away from the city, and she watched the water through the passenger window and did not ask again. She had learned, in the months of this second beginning, that Victor communicated through action as much as language, and that what he did with physical space, where he took her, what he showed her, the choreography of the things he arranged, was as legible as what he said, if not more so. He parked on a street she recognized eventually as a street near Wicker Park, a neighborhood she'd lived in peripherally when she was 21 and 22, a neighborhood of converted lofts and old churches, and the particular character of a place where the city shows its grain. He walked her to a church. Not a grand church, a small one, stone, old, with an arched doorway and a small garden beside it that was mostly dormant in February, but had clearly been something more in better weather. She looked at it, and she knew it. "This is where we met," she said. "Not met," he said. "The party in the building across the street, that was where we met. This is where I first saw you." He looked at the church. "You were sitting on that bench." He indicated a stone bench in the garden. "It was raining. You were reading, and you had an umbrella, but it wasn't quite doing its job, and you were slightly damp and entirely untroubled by being slightly damp, and I stopped walking because I couldn't—" He stopped. She looked at the bench. She didn't remember this. Or rather, she remembered the afternoon she'd been sitting there reading in the rain, the summer she was 20, and she had not known she was being observed. "Victor," she said. He turned to her. He had something in his coat pocket that he had been aware of, she could tell now, a slight weight on one side, a slight attentiveness to it. He took out the red velvet box, the same one, from the Meridian. She would have recognized it anywhere by now. He opened it, and the sapphire ring sat in its velvet bed in the February light, and he looked at her with the full, direct, concentrated attention that was the most characteristically him thing in the world. He did not kneel. Victor Hale was not a kneeling kind of man, and she would not have wanted him to be. He stood before her at full height, the box in his hands, the church at his back, and he said, "Elena Ward, I have loved you since a rainy afternoon on a bench in Wicker Park when you were 20 years old and entirely unaware of me. I have loved you through 9 years of your very sensible and very agonizing absence. I have loved you in photographs and in memory and in the presence we've managed to build since October. And I intend to love you for whatever comes next." He paused. "I am not a simple man. I come with a world attached. I know what I'm asking. I know what you'd be walking toward, and I know what you'd be choosing to bear, and I wouldn't ask it of you if I didn't believe, if I didn't know, that you were exactly the person capable of standing in that world like you belong to it, because you do." He stopped. "Will you marry me?" he said.
Elena looked at the ring and at the man and at the church and at the bench where a 20-year-old version of herself had sat in the rain, reading without knowing she was being watched.
Yes, she said. He put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it against her hand. The sapphire, the color of the lake, exactly right. And then she looked at him, and there was nothing between them. No distance, no 9 years, no architecture of avoidance. Just this. She stood at the mirror. This was 3 days after the church, 2 days after she had told Lucas, who had looked at the ring for a long moment, and then looked at her and said, with all the quiet certainty of a man who had been waiting for exactly this, "Good, it's about time." She stood at the vanity mirror in her rooms at the Ward estate, in the early morning light of a February day, with Victor's ring on her left hand. She was still in her robe, hadn't yet dressed, was in that specific morning hour when the demands of the day had not yet assembled and the mind is most honest with itself. She looked at the ring. The sapphire caught the light and threw it in a way that was different from any other light she'd seen from it. The morning light of the bedroom, specifically this bedroom in this house, giving the stone a warmth that the meridian's ambient lighting or the February sun outside the church hadn't shown her. It was the right ring. It had always been the right ring, made for her specific hand by someone who had seen her and known her and waited an unreasonable amount of time for the opportunity to ask. She thought about everything that had brought her to this mirror. 9 years of Seattle, the hedge fund, the Sunday park, the 2 kind, stable men she dated and let go, the flight back in October with her composed hands and her composure performance, and the skyline coming at her like a fist. 11 days of professional distance. The shirt on the bed, the photographs, the storm and the dark office, and the kiss that had lasted 9 years compressed into a single moment. Her brother. She heard it then, from next door, from Lucas's room. The sound she had been learning to register as both ordinary and not ordinary. The sound that was becoming the ambient texture of life in the Ward estate in February. The cough. It came and went in its usual pattern, and the walls of the old house carried it to her. And she stood at the mirror with the ring on her hand and listened to it and felt the double weight of everything she was holding. She was so happy. She was so frightened. She was in the right place, doing the right thing with the right people. And one of those people was running out of time. And the happiness and the grief were not separable. They were the same substance, the same feeling wearing different clothes, the joy of presence inseparable from the knowledge of its limit. She looked at herself in the mirror, 31 years old, dark hair around her shoulders still uncombed, the ring on her hand. The coughing from the room next door had stopped. In a few minutes, she would go to Lucas's room and knock, and take him his morning coffee, and sit with him in whatever shape the morning found him. She would do this today and tomorrow and for as many days as remained, because this was what the decision had cost, and this was what the decision was worth. The whole of it, the joy and the grief, the future and the diminishing present, the ring and the coughing in the room next door. She was not going to look away from any of it. She was done with the distance, done with the careful management, done with exile as a form of love. She was exactly here. Victor came at 9 o'clock, as he had been coming most mornings, and she met him in the hallway between the kitchen and the study, and he looked at her face and read everything in it the way he always read everything. "How is he?" he said. "Difficult morning," she said. "Better now. He's asking for you." Victor nodded. He moved toward Lucas's study, and she fell in beside him, and they walked the corridor of the Ward estate in the winter morning light, together, toward the same room, for the same person. She took his hand. He looked down at their joined hands and then at her, and the expression on his face was the one she kept catching him with, not the composed, authoritative, cold public face of Victor Hale, Don of the Chicago underworld, but the private face, the one beneath, the one that had been waiting 9 years for permission to be visible. "I love you," he said. "I know," she said. She said it back, and she meant all the dimensions of it, the whole 9 years and all the mornings before and all the mornings yet to come. They knocked on Lucas's door. He called them in, and the winter light was on the study windows, and Lucas Ward looked up from his desk with the expression of a man who is not ready to go, but who, looking at the two people in his doorway, has found something that makes the going bearable. "You're late," he said. "Both of you." "We're exactly on time," Victor said. "That's a matter of interpretation," Lucas said. "Sit down, there's coffee." They sat, and the morning arranged itself around them, and outside, the lake continued its gray and gold career, indifferent to human chronologies, proceeding as always. March came to Chicago with its usual mixed signals. Cold still in the mornings, the lake restless, but something turning in the light, something that said, not yet, but soon. The particular quality of late winter in the city Elena had spent 9 years telling herself she didn't miss. The way the days lengthened incrementally. The way the cold eventually went from mean to merely bracing. The way the first actual warmth, when it came, felt like a gift rather than an expectation. She ran in the mornings, and she worked, and she sat with her brother, and she was with Victor in the evenings, and the life she was building was so different from the one she'd maintained in Seattle that they barely seemed to be the same category of existence. Richer, she thought. Not in the financial sense, though she was not indifferent to the financial reality either. Richer in the way of things that matter, in density of feeling, in the presence of people she loved, in the difficulty and the fullness of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Lucas was having a better month. His doctors had adjusted his treatment, and there had been a period of relative improvement. The cough less aggressive, the fatigue less absolute, his ability to engage with the world recovering some of its former range. He had been to the Meridian for dinner once, the three of them, and had sat at the corner table that had been his for 20 years, and ordered his usual whiskey with the unhurried certainty of a man who has decided to occupy his habits as long as he can. Elena had watched him that night and thought, this, exactly this is what I came back for. On a Friday in late March, Victor appeared at the estate at midday. He had, in the months since December, become a fixture of the estate in a way that had ceased to require comment. Marcus no longer announced him at the gate. The kitchen no longer adjusted its planning for his presence. He moved through the house with the ease of a man who has stopped visiting and started inhabiting. This had happened gradually and was now complete. He found Elena in the garden. She had started spending her lunch hour there when the weather permitted it, because the lake was visible from the garden bench and because she had missed it, had missed the particular combination of wind and water and the breathing room of open sky. He sat beside her. She looked at him. He had something in his bearing that was different, a quality of settled intention, a completeness to his stillness. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was in the city this morning, the Ricci situation concluded. I saw the message. And the Lakeview properties. The last of the account irregularities have been addressed. The Castellano renegotiation is holding." "I know," she said. "I was there for most of it." "I know," he said. "I'm just—" He looked at the lake. "I'm taking stock, noting that things are—" He stopped. "Good?" she offered. "More than good," he said. "Correct. Things are correct." She understood what he meant. Not perfect. Victor was too clear-eyed for the word perfect, and their life was not perfect, was complex and weighted and full of sorrow as well as love. But correct. The thing that had been wrong for 9 years had been made right. And the rightness was not fragile, was not the precarious happiness of people who fear it will be taken. It was solid, built. She leaned against him. "There's something I want to do," she said. "Tell me." "I want to plan the wedding in a way that lets Lucas be properly present for it." She paused. "Not an enormous thing. Not the kind of production the Ward name tends to attract. Something that is actually about the two of us, and about him, and about the people who matter." She looked at the lake. "Soon. Before the summer." Victor was quiet. "Yes," he said. She turned to look at him. "Whatever you want," he said. "However you want it." He held her gaze with the direct, complete attention she had stopped being afraid of. "I have been waiting 13 years for this. I can wait until Tuesday, or I can wait until July. I have demonstrated some capacity for patience." "You have," she said. "Though I'd prefer not to wait until July," he said. She laughed,
And it was the real laugh, the full one, the kind she had not had access to for the better part of a decade. "May," she said. "The Ward Estate garden. Something small." "Perfect," he said. And that was the planning of the wedding of Elena Ward and Victor Hale. 5 words, on a garden bench beside a lake in March, with the wind coming in cold and the light beginning to change. The morning after, Elena stood before the mirror in her room and looked at her own reflection in the particular way she had been looking at it for months now. Not checking, not appraising, but simply looking, with the fullness of someone who is present in their own life. The ring was on her hand. From the room next door, faint but audible, came the sound of her brother coughing. It rose and fell and resolved. She looked at herself and at the ring, and she thought about everything she was stepping toward. The man who had waited 13 years with a ring in his safe and a shirt on his bed. The organization she was inheriting with all its weight and its history and its requirement for exactly the kind of person she had become. The brother who was still here, whose mornings were sometimes easy and sometimes hard, and who was, in either case, exactly himself. The city below them, living its ancient and indifferent and beloved life. She thought about the word embers, how it described the thing that remains after the fire has done its work. Not the dramatic combustion, not the initial igniting, but the persistent heat that stays when everything else has cooled. How embers are not the beginning of fire, or the aftermath of it, but the evidence of what was real. She and Victor were embers, had always been. 9 years of distance had not extinguished the heat, only concealed it under the gray surface of careful living, and all it had taken was the right conditions, the right return, the oxygen of honesty and proximity, to bring it back to what it had always been. Not a flame, but something better. The deep, persistent, actual warmth of a thing that does not need drama to be real. She would step out into this life, the dangerous and luminous life of the Ward Empire, with its dark corridors and long shadows and the particular beauty of power held by people who have paid for it. She would step out with Victor's hand in hers and her brother's blessing on her back, and the 9 years behind her, not as wounds, but as the proof that what she was walking toward was worth the walking. She looked at the ring one more time. She thought about the church, the bench in the rain, a 20-year-old girl reading without knowing she was being seen, and a man who had stopped walking because of her, and the 13 years it had taken for them to arrive at the same room at the same time without anything between them. She set her shoulders, she opened her bedroom door, and Elena Ward walked out to meet the morning. From the room next door, the coughing had quieted. From down the corridor came the smell of coffee. From the garden, through the open window at the end of the hall, came the cold, clean smell of the lake. And from the entrance hall, where Victor Hale stood at exactly 7:55 in the morning, in his dark coat, with the patience of a man who has always known exactly where he is going and exactly who he is going to find when he arrives, came the sound of footsteps on the stairs. She came around the landing and saw him. He looked up, and across the distance of a hallway, in the ordinary morning light of a March Thursday in Chicago, they looked at each other the way people look at each other when they have earned the looking, with nothing held back, nothing managed, nothing between the seeing and the seen. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. She walked down the stairs and took his hand, and they went to find her brother, and the embers burned.